Okay, well, thank you, Evgeny, for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you everyone for coming. Let me start today's discussion with the front page news that many of you must have seen this morning, photographs from Mariupol. Mariupol is a city on Azov Sea. As you can see, it's depicted right here. It's a city of about 500,000 people. The city has a long history, goes back to the Greek settlements, and it is very cosmopolitan. I visited the city about 3 years ago for my field research on the origins of the war in eastern Ukraine. That city that was very quiet, very cozy, small town, still bore the scars of 2014. The central government building, the mayor's office of this city, was burned during the clashes between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian protesters. The police office and police station of this city was also burned down. And the government made an effort, actually intentionally avoided repairing both of these buildings. And as the mayor of the city told me back in 2018, they wanted to leave these buildings as they were in order to communicate to the locals about the price, about the cost of attempts to bring this city and Donbass in general into Russia. Now the city, of course, has been under siege by the Russian forces for a week. The recent bombardments of the civilian buildings in Mariupol demonstrated to us a shift in the Russian tactic. We clearly see an attempt by the Russians to inflict additional pain on the civilians. And of course, any type of civilian victimization on the part of the advancing army is an attempt to coerce the defensive side, to coerce the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian authorities, to yield the city to the invading troops. So far, about 1,200 people were confirmed dead. That is according to the claim today from the deputy mayor. But he estimates the total number of casualties may be in up to 20,000 because so many buildings have been destroyed. And the communal services just cannot work to remove the wreckage from these buildings because of the continuous shelling of the city from air. So we are seeing airstrikes that are coming from the Russian planes. We see the bombardment of the city that is happening basically 24/7. And because of that, we also see for the first time the attempts to bury bodies of the people, of the civilians killed in mass graves, because people are afraid of going to the cemeteries and organizing proper burials. As a result, you see for the first time the ceremony of mass graves, where people are just burying their loved ones and fleeing back into safety. These types of atrocities also indicate or reflect recognition on the part of Russia that a quick and easy victory that they might have expected at the beginning of this military campaign is not coming. And the recognition that the resistance that is coming from the Ukrainian people living in multiple cities under attack today of Russian forces is strong enough to stop Russian troops from moving in. We see on this map cities of Kharkiv surrounded or partially surrounded by the Russian troops, the city of Sumy partially surrounded, city of Cherkasy. Kiev, of course, is also partially surrounded by the troops and consistently shelled. And the city of Kherson has been captured by the Russian military, but the mayor of this city continues to defy Russian military occupation. Now, very briefly, I wanted to stress in today's talk that the conflict, that the war that we are seeing between Russia and Ukraine today and the military aggression that Putin began in 2014, and that continues now through full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is part of a longer Russian-Ukrainian relationship and part of a longer pattern of actions of Vladimir Putin with regard to Ukraine. In fact, if you look at the total number of presidents that Putin faced, you can see that irrespective of whether you had a pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian president, using these crude terms of identifying their preferences. So either you have Kuchma, who was viewed as pro-Russian, or Yanukovych, or you had Yushchenko, Poroshenko, who were viewed as pro-Western. Irrespective of their foreign policy preferences, you saw that Putin consistently applied pressure and tried to coerce these presidents to move in his desired direction. Each of the presidents of Ukraine over the period of the last 22 years faced significant crises. So the crisis of 2004 was the crisis of the Orange Revolution. The crisis of 2009 was the crisis of energy supplies that were cut off by Russia. The crisis of 2013 was, of course, the beginning of Euromaidan revolution. 2014 was the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. And finally, we are now seeing the full-scale invasion, which is the apex of that entire process of attack or pressure on Ukraine. And in many of these crises, Ukrainian authorities actually made some concessions. And as you can see here, in most of the crises that Ukrainian presidents faced, they made deals with the Russian authorities, deals that allowed them, Ukraine, to avoid the worst scenario, the scenario that we are facing today. And possibly, when we think about the reasons for the attack on Ukraine, for the full-scale invasion of the Russian troops, possibly one of the reasons why we think Putin actually decided against all the rational predictions of many experts, both Russian and Ukrainian and Western experts, that he's going to do it, that he decided to send troops because he saw that in the past, application of pressure yielded him certain gains, yielded him certain deals. Just briefly to go through some of the ways in which he tried to pressure Ukraine: issued territorial claims on parts of Ukrainian territory very early on in his presidency, interfered in presidential elections, terminated the provision of gas to Ukraine, threatened to introduce economic sanctions in 2013. Of course, Ukraine became a target of multiple cyber warfare operations by the Russian special forces, starting from 2013 onwards. And from 2014, we see an increased use of force, application of force, both from the outside with the Russian troops, but also inside Ukraine, the use of multiple Russian agents to destabilize Ukraine and assassinate some of the key individuals within Ukraine. In addition to that, Putin managed to build up an entire infrastructure of pro-Russian actors within Ukraine, starting with a range of different oligarchs, like Dmitro Firtash, for example, who were making money on the sale of Russian gas, were used by Putin as intermediaries in these sales. And by corrupting Ukrainian business elite, he also gained access to Ukrainian, not just business, but political elite, because many of these oligarchs and businessmen then funded political projects, created media, television channels, newspapers, websites that promoted and advanced pro-Russian narratives. And as a result, we see, despite the beginning of the war in 2014, we see a rise in the strength of the pro-Russian media in Ukraine. I think last year we had about 5 television channels which were owned by exactly the same structures, close to a man called Viktor Medvedchuk, was viewed as one of the strongest political actors in Ukraine, who had the strongest ties to Putin. Over the last year, Zelensky destroyed or shut down many of these media outlets and ultimately went after Medvedchuk himself by putting him in under house arrest. So these levers of influence that Putin has exercised over the last several years, they actually became less and less effective. And it's important also to understand that the Donbass war, the insurgency, and then the full-scale Russian invasion of Donbass in August of 2014 really represented a turning point in Putin's strategy with regard to Ukraine. By creating these two separatist entities, the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, and by protecting them from sure defeat at the, by Ukrainian troops in August of 2014, Putin basically created a zone of permanent instability. The zone of instability that he can use at any time for his advantage, and can use also to influence public opinion in Russia, because many of the anti-Ukrainian grievances that you hear in the Russian media, anti-Ukrainian grievances that are expressed by Russian politicians, they are based on the example of what Ukraine supposedly is doing with regard to the civilians in these two separatist republics. So for the last 8 years, he was using these separatist republics for the mobilization of anti-Ukrainian attitudes in Russia, for the consolidation of the view that we hear now is prevalent among many Russian citizens, that Ukraine represents a threat somehow to Russia, and hence that can be used as a pretext for the full-scale attack against the Ukrainian state. Now, we also remember that in 2015, the Minsk Agreements have been signed that were meant to settle the conflict. And Minsk Agreements of 2015, signed in February with the mediation of France and Germany, were meant to provide special status to Donbass, which was a de facto autonomy, in return for the reintegration of these separatist republics into the Ukrainian territory. For many in the West and for many Western diplomats, Minsk Agreements represented a promise of peace. They represented a promise that somehow this conflict can be settled for a long period of time. But what's also important to understand is that the Minsk Agreements had very limited legitimacy within the Ukrainian society. And one of the reasons why the implementation of the Minsk Agreement was at some point stalled and never got anywhere was because many Ukrainians viewed Minsk Agreements as signed under pressure, under coercive pressure, at the time when Russian troops were basically moving further into the Ukrainian territory, and hence threatening directly the integrity of the state. And because many viewed these agreements as highly unfavorable from the Ukrainian national standpoint of national interest, both Poroshenko and Zelensky were trying to communicate to the West and bargain on a new set of steps that need to be taken within the Minsk Agreements that would somehow ensure that the Ukrainian interests will be honored and taken into account. That means primarily holding elections in these separatist republics only after Russian troops withdraw from these republics, so that you can actually have a meaningful competitive process with the participation of Ukrainian political forces. It also meant that from the Ukrainian standpoint, many of the leaders of these separatist republics and key officials in these separatist republics cannot really govern these territories, primarily because many of them committed serious crimes against the Ukrainian citizens. So many of these points of contention ultimately prevented both sides from moving forward with the implementation of Minsk. But it's also important to remember that it was Russia that in 2019 violated the key terms of the Minsk Agreement by starting to distribute, for example, citizenship to the residents of Donbass. It happened right after Zelensky was elected as president. And remember, Zelensky was elected on the promise of peace. He was showing signs that he was willing to negotiate with Putin. And even despite this fact, Putin was initiating a wide distribution of citizenship or passports to residents of Donbass, Ukrainian citizens, that was then used as a pretext for the full-scale invasion that we saw 2 weeks ago, that began 2 weeks ago. The stalling of the Minsk talks clearly favored Ukraine, because the longer the Minsk is not implemented, the stronger Ukraine was becoming militarily. It was acquiring a lot of military assistance from the United States and from the West. And Putin was also realizing that he was losing key levers of influence within Ukraine because many of these media outlets were banned and pro-Russian actors like Viktor Medvedchuk were weakened by criminal investigations against them. There were several important opportunity factors that might have created a favorable strategic environment for Putin to act and to make this decision to invade Ukraine. One, of course, is a perceived weakness of the West and specifically of the United States. I work at Baylor University in the United States, and I hear this discourse that it became very prevalent, especially with the end of the Trump administration, with the end of the Trump presidency, and the insurrection of January 6th. The idea that somehow American leadership in the world is on the decline, that American democracy is in danger, and with the withdrawal of American troops in Afghanistan that was conducted in a manner that really showed a lack of insight on the part of key intelligence agencies within the United States. It also demonstrated to actors like Vladimir Putin that the United States is averse to further intervention, that is averse from showing strength on the international arena. And hence it demonstrated some type of a strategic window of opportunity for Putin to act against Ukraine. The circumstances of this invasion were also favorable because, as you remember, 2 years ago, the protests against the electoral fraud in Belarus allowed Putin to subordinate Lukashenko fully to his wishes. Lukashenko, for a long time, showed a degree of independence with regard to Putin. But after the electoral protests, after the failure of the democratic movement in Belarus to remove Lukashenko, he became fully dependent economically, politically, and security-wise on Putin's desires. And as we saw at the beginning of the invasion, part of his invasion plan was based on the calculation that Belarus would be used as a platform for the Russian troops moving into the Ukrainian territory. There is also, by the way, a discussion now of the possibility of the use of Belarusian troops in other parts of Ukraine. Putin also dismantled civil society organizations with the poisoning of Navalny and then his jailing. He increased pressure on the opposition leaders in Russia. He shut down many of the news media in Russia. Many of the key influential leaders of civil society were forced into exile. And as a result, there is no basis right now in Russia to organize any serious protest against the war. And of course, the change in the constitution allowed Putin to rule until 2036, so that horizon, the strategic long-term horizon, the planning of the future allows him to plan for a longer period of rule. Now, the pretext for the war have both strategic dimension and political dimension. The strategic dimension is based on two claims. One claim I already mentioned is that Ukraine represents a threat to Donbass. And just yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, Russian propaganda channels were showing some kind of documents that were supposed to prove that Ukraine was about to attack cities in Donbass, like Donetsk and Luhansk. Of course, anyone who is familiar with the Ukrainian side of the story understands that Ukraine has no intention, it has no serious capacity to really attack these cities, and it really went against the key interests as they were articulated by Zelensky as far as the resolution of the conflict by peaceful means. And Zelensky consistently emphasized the need to resolve the conflict peacefully. Of course, a second dimension of this defensive rhetoric is about the NATO enlargement. And here again, we see that it is completely taken out of context because there is no indication that NATO was about to bring Ukraine into alliance anytime soon. There were no real serious discussions of Ukraine accelerating its path to membership in NATO. And of course, membership action plan that was promised to Ukraine in the Bucharest summit in 2008 never was realized. Ukraine never got membership action plan at all, and that is something that the Ukrainian authorities were complaining about. So the claim that Ukraine somehow is closer now to the integration with NATO is completely unfounded. The second dimension is a political dimension of his pretext, and that is the argument that somehow Putin and the Russian troops are liberating Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine who are captured by what he calls the Nazis in power. We all understand that when you look at the top officials in the Ukrainian government, you see that most of them are actually Russian speakers. Volodymyr Zelensky learned how to speak Ukrainian only during the election campaign. Most of his election campaign messages were in Russian, and he made a very good career in the entertainment industry in Russia. So it is completely absurd to imagine that you have some kind of a nationalist capture of the Ukrainian government. So ultimately, the foundation for the attack on Ukraine, I think, is a long-term rejection of Putin, of the idea that Ukrainians deserve to have an independent state. And he spent quite some time in his speech articulating this notion that Ukraine as a state is somehow an artificial entity, was created by Lenin or Stalin, that Ukrainian nation was not capable of showing any results of state building over the last 30 years, and that Ukraine was on the verge of the bankruptcy. So these ideas, I think, were meant to communicate this ideological belief that Putin has, that Ukraine as a state should not exist. And that is why I think most of that operation is not just about temporary control over parts of Ukraine, but establishing a permanent base of control that would allow Russia to form a sympathetic government, a puppet regime, form some kind of a satellite state that would act in the interest of Putin. And what's interesting is that when you see these four directions of assault from the north, from the northeast, from Donbass, and from Crimea that Ukraine was subjected to on the first day of war, you also notice that each of these areas, these four areas, actually overlap with the level, the regions with the highest support for pro-Russian political parties. These are the results from 2019 election to the Ukrainian parliament. And you see that the blue, the intensity of the blue reflects the strength of support for pro-Russian political forces. And it is exactly these areas where the support for these pro-Russian parties is the highest, and the cities with the highest support, like Kharkiv, for example, are now targeted by the indiscriminate military campaign of Vladimir Putin. So what is the end game? What is the expected end game of Putin in Ukraine? I already mentioned that one scenario is an attempt to create a permanently divided Ukraine along the German model, where you have southeast separated from the rest of Ukraine, from the right bank, and sort of return to the 17th century division of Ukraine into two large parts, where one would be a puppet regime or a satellite state, another would function as maybe potentially pro-Western state that would have no real ability to choose alliances and would be under constant threat from Russia. The second scenario is the fragmentation of Ukraine into multiple statelets. And we already seen indications that some of the Russian agents may be implying that this is what they're really pushing for. In a number of these oblast centers, they are raising this idea of creating these people's republics that would function as a federation. And this idea was articulated by a number of Russian propagandists and media, that somehow different oblasts will basically function as quasi-independent states and would form a pro-Russian federation of states with a very different set of rules than the rest of Ukraine would have. And finally, the scenario number three, which clearly is unrealistic at this point after 2 weeks of very strong resistance to the Russian aggression on the part of Ukrainians, that is the subordination of the entire Ukraine and the transformation of Ukraine into a second Belarus, where all regions of Ukraine would be somehow dominated by Russia. Now, as I mentioned, the shift in the Russian strategy became clear first with the bombing of Kharkiv, the main square of Kharkiv, Independence Square, the key government buildings in Kharkiv. But it also becomes very evident today with the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Mariupol and the attack on the civilians in the city, that Russia is trying to raise the costs of further resistance of Ukrainians to the Russian invasion. And it understands that future costs of military operation for Russia will be increasing exponentially because of the external pressure and external sanctions that are imposed on the Russian state. And this desire to achieve a very quick victory is clearly not realized or is not met, as we see that none of the cities, major cities in Ukraine, apart from Kherson, has been captured, seized by the Russian troops. And some of the key obstacles that Russia faces right now in Ukraine is, first of all, a tremendous popular mobilization for war. Any type of contribution is something that about 80% of Ukrainians consider. So the recent poll demonstrated that about 80% of Ukrainians indicated some degree of involvement in the effort to counter the Russian aggression, either in the form of participation in the military or in the form of provision of some kind of volunteer services, medical services, etc. And so for many Ukrainians, what we are seeing right now is really a people's war, a war for the independence of Ukraine. We also see nonviolent resistance in the occupied cities like Kherson, Melitopol, where people who are not armed come out in large numbers with Ukrainian flags. They sing Ukrainian anthem, and they demonstrate against the Russian soldiers and tell them to go home. This requires huge courage, a lot of resolve, but it also is quite effective because it undermines the key premise of Putin's war on Ukraine, and that is that people somehow want to be liberated in Ukraine, that they somehow earn for the presence of the Russian troops. Of course, for propaganda purposes, the Russian media channels cannot really demonstrate that there is any evidence whatsoever that the Ukrainians are welcoming Russian presence. And finally, compared to 2014, there is no real division within the ruling and political and business elites in Ukraine. None of the key political leaders embraced Putin's narratives. And everyone is exactly on the same side as far as the need to mobilize against the Russian aggression. These are photographs from the several cities, towns that were occupied by the Russians, and that demonstrates the way in which many civilians in Ukraine are protesting against the Russian military occupation. A few days ago, I published an article on open democracy about the challenges that many local government officials would face when they see the military presence of the Russian troops. And that article was informed by my own research in 2014, when the reason for the quick takeover of many towns in Donbass by the separatists was primarily because of cooperation or collaboration of the local authorities with these separatist leaders. Now, in contrast to 2014, we actually do not see any instance of collaboration. I think one of the mayors was somehow expressed his desire to collaborate with the Russians, and he was immediately taken or arrested by the Ukrainian police on the charges of treason. But other major mayors and city leaders are actually serving as focal points of resistance. They actively use social media. They make public pronouncements in support of Ukraine, despite the fact that the military, the Russian military, is standing on their streets. So we don't see any major defection of local officials. And that, for me, indicates that this plan for occupation of Ukraine is not going to work, or it will be very difficult for them to carry it out, primarily because we see that Russians do not have anyone to draw on to replace these pro-Ukrainian officials for the purposes of administering these territories. And I thought that the work of one political scientist who looked at the track record of occupation is very useful for us when we think about the future of occupation, the Russian occupation in Ukraine. He argued that for occupation to succeed, three factors are important. One is the recognition of the need for occupation, when the local population recognizes that an occupying regime, for example, will invest funds into the economic reconstruction of the territory. The second is the perception of a common threat to the occupied territories, where the local populace would view the occupier as someone who would protect them. And the third is the credible promise of the temporary nature of occupation, when an occupying regime actually promises to leave these territories after a certain amount of time. And we see that none of these three preconditions are present in Ukraine. We see that clearly the value that the majority of people attach to the Ukrainian independence far outweighs any benefits that one can expect to receive from the Russian presence. There is a strong rejection of the Russian military or any type of political presence on these territories. We also see that the only threat that people perceive is coming from Russia, and the greater is this indiscriminate nature of bombardments and the use of violence by the Russian forces, the more likely we are going to see that strengthening of this perception that threat is really coming only from one side. And finally, of course, no one in Ukraine trusts Putin anymore. So his promises, and he in fact did promise in his public speech that there will be no occupation, his promises really are not credible for most Ukrainians. But the fight, of course, that Ukraine faces, it may be quite long. The recent polls showed that Ukrainians actually are quite optimistic about the future. Even though for many years, the polls showed that Ukrainians in general tend to be pessimistic about the economic outlook of their country, the poll that was conducted just a week after the start of the invasion demonstrated that 90% of Ukrainians look into the future with hope. And absolute majority of Ukrainians believe that the war will be victorious, that Russia will be defeated, and in fact, it will happen in a relatively short period of time, in a matter of weeks or months. Very few Ukrainians believe that this will persist for years. But for that to happen, of course, there is a desire to see greater economic, but also military assistance to Ukraine. And just the poll that I've seen today, about 90% of Ukrainians want NATO to introduce no-fly zone. So there is a great demand for more tangible type of protection that the Western alliance can show to the Ukrainians, apart from just providing weapons and funding Ukrainian war effort. I think it is also important through symbolic steps, like, for example, by putting Ukraine on the accelerated path to membership in the European Union, to show that Ukrainian sacrifice for the future of Europe and for the security of Europe is appreciated. And so by doing that, you will certainly reinforce these political and economic aspirations that Ukraine have expressed for many years, as far as joining the West and joining Europe is concerned. The other side of this equation, of course, is about limiting Russia's access to resources, both to conduct war, resources that would increase costs on the Russian economy, make it more difficult for the Russian leaders, political leaders, to fund the war effort in Ukraine. But also, I think we also have to realize that the response of the Russian society will matter a lot. And hence, I think sanctions that are meant to raise the costs for an average Russian, and sanctions that we're seeing today with the withdrawal of many foreign companies from Russia, with the limitation on the use of currency for the Russian citizens, the banning, the boycotts, etc., of Russian public figures. All of this, I think, is meant to communicate to the Russian society that without their involvement, without their public expression of protest against this unjust aggression against Ukraine, Without that, it will be difficult to imagine that the war will end very soon. Finally, I want to stress that assistance to Ukraine depends also on the efforts of individuals in many countries around the world. And the humanitarian relief efforts were just nothing short of amazing. I know a number of students at SAIS have been engaged in collecting donations for Ukraine, which is a great effort. There are other ways in which we can help Ukrainian scholars, Ukrainian students who are now in danger today and in the future. But there are also ways in which you can contribute to the humanitarian relief. National Bank of Ukraine has this hub where they collect all of the donations. So bank.gov.ua is the best source to approach for individual donations. I will end with that, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the presentation. Now we have some time for the Q&A. We have already several questions in the Q&A box online. Please, if you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I want to start with those in the audience, and then we will move to questions that we have online. I also have to apologize. I will have to leave in the middle to another event, so my colleague, Professor Vakil, will switch me as the moderator. So let's start with what we have in the audience. So Kelly?
Callie from the US, and thank you all for coming. I was curious to learn a little bit more about the extent of the sanctions. I know they're not, economic sanctions aren't having the intended outcome right now, but I was wondering in the long term, what that looks like.
So I think that we can think about the effect of sanctions in several dimensions. So the first, of course, is the economic sanctions that we're seeing now adopted with regard to the Russian economy, and it has immediate effect in the sense that we see huge lines of Russians at the ATM machines. They are clearly concerned about access to currency in the future. We see that the government already is responding to these sanctions by limiting access of average Russians to foreign currency. We see that the Russian currency has been depreciating consistently over the last 2 weeks, and that certainly would have a significant effect in terms of the prices that Russians would be seeing in the future. I think in general, the economic shock that Russia may be experiencing in the next weeks or months may be comparable to what Russia has experienced in 1998, where you have a massive Russian default that coincided with the depreciation of the currency and the withdrawal of key investors, key foreign banks from the Russian market. That shock, I think, will may also be much stronger, primarily because many of the foreign industries, foreign companies are ceasing their total operation in Russia. And there is a discussion now among Russian elites. I just read Medvedev's statement this morning, that they may be nationalizing all of these companies that will be ending their operations in Russia, which by itself would be quite scandalous if you think about that all of the assets that these foreign companies have would be nationalized by the decision of the Russian authorities. So I think it is clear that economic sanctions have immediate effect in the short term, in the next weeks. But the strongest sanctions are yet to come. So I read the Italian government's decision yesterday to stop any dependence on Russian gas in the next 30 months. That is clearly something that many other Western governments should emulate in terms of their promises to basically cut any types of revenues that would go into the Russian economy and finance Russian war effort. Of course, we would have liked to see a more quicker type of response. The United States, for example, announced that they will not be purchasing any Russian oil whatsoever. But the United States obviously is much less dependent on these energy supplies than other European countries. And I think that part, it's important, even if it's a medium-term kind of commitment, it certainly forms or shapes the expectations many within the Russian political and business elite about what's going to happen. Some of my colleagues, for example, are hopeful that maybe Russian oligarchs and the sanctions against Russian oligarchs that we've seen introduced today in Britain may be more effective. I personally doubt that, because Russian oligarchs over the last 20 years have been basically sidelined. They do not represent an independent force. They don't have any type of political or civic infrastructure to rely on. And so these will be losses that they would just have to accept. But if you see a broader movement within the Russian political elite, a recognition that Russia is on the verge of the bankruptcy and that Putin's actions are wrecking the future of the Russian state, that may potentially have more important effects in the sense of producing some kind of a split within the Russian political elite that may ultimately lead to either a change in the policy or possibly to the removal of Putin. Of course, many Sovietologists, I read the discussion about whether or not that is a likely occurrence given the history of the Soviet Union. There were not that many successful coups once Khrushchev was removed through collegiate decision-making and through coordination of Politburo. But that was probably the only instance when it was successful. Gorbachev was also attempted. There was attempted removal of Gorbachev in 1998, but that was much less successful. So I think, again, these sanctions are important, but we have to recognize that the strongest effect, the effect on the political and business elite, will take some time before it will materialize.
Thank you. So let's move to some questions from the Q&A box. And again, I ask everyone on Zoom, please don't use the chat function. Put your questions in the Q&A. So there is an interesting question here on those, and the question is this: do you see with hindsight any way we as the West or Ukraine could have avoided getting into this war altogether? So what do you think?
I think the trajectory of Putin's actions that I just described clearly indicated that he expected some type of concession on the part of the Ukrainian authorities that would lead them to the rejection of their pro-Western path. In other words, the only way in which you could imagine that this war would be fully avoided is by voluntary limitation or self-limitation that would be imposed by the Ukrainian political elites on the society as far as their sovereign choice is concerned. And given the type of response we've seen from the Ukrainian society after 2014, where clearly Russia presented itself as an aggressor state that has very strong hostile intentions to Ukraine, wants to demolish Ukraine or somehow weaken it, it is very hard for me to imagine that any type of political leader, whether it's pro-Western or pro-Russian, would be able to implement actually any of the policies that would satisfy Putin, primarily because of the possible strong resistance from within the society. We understand that Zelensky, for example, might have some illusions or expectations that he can conduct or adopt policies that would be acceptable for Putin, that he can make a deal with Putin. That was his initial claim that he made at the beginning of his presidency. But he also very quickly understood that any deal that he makes with Putin would not be accepted by a large part of the Ukrainian society, and hence there is no real point in making this deal. So I think, to answer this question, at best we could have expected that the war could have been postponed for some time, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. But ultimately, I think because of the structural constraints that all the Ukrainian leaders face today, it is difficult to imagine an outcome that would have satisfied, political outcome that would be sustainable and that would have satisfied Putin.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Professor Frozini?
Hello, I'm Justin Frozini. I teach comparative constitutional law and EU law here at CITES. First of all, thank you, Professor Kudelia, because it was a very enlightening talk that you gave, and I actually learned a lot. My question is this: you mentioned the fact that Putin has kept himself in power until 2036 with reforms to the constitution of the Russian Federation. I want to ask you this: how does the amendment to the Ukrainian constitution of 2019, where Poroshenko introduced these so-called Euro-Atlantic aspirations into the Ukrainian constitution that were then confirmed by Zelensky when he became president, how do they play in? How did these amendments in any way provoke Putin? Was there any reaction? I've obviously looked at this from a constitutional standpoint, but not looking at it in terms of Russia's reaction to this. And how could these provisions of the constitution sort of be an obstacle to any future deal?
Yes, that's a crucial question. Thank you. So I would say that initially these amendments, and let me just explain what these amendments were about. So shortly before the end of Poroshenko's presidency, the majority of the Ukrainian parliament adopted an amendment to the constitution that stated that Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations cannot be reversed. So it is a constitutional requirement for the president of Ukraine to continue on the path of joining NATO, to continue on the path of joining the European Union. And that in a way limited the room for maneuver of any successor that Poroshenko would have, and sort of imposed a set of foreign policy choices on all future presidents, right? At that time, it was viewed, and I viewed it as a largely symbolic step. I did not view it as something that would have any meaningful implications for the future of Ukraine. But we also see that when Zelensky became president, he tried to be more flexible in dealing with Russia. But very quickly, he understood that the corridor that was set for him does not allow for a high degree of flexibility. And that, in fact, as many his political opponents argued, the choice that he can make is the choice only either joining NATO or joining European Union or stepping down as president. And then he can advocate whatever he wants, but he cannot remain president because of these constitutional requirements. I'm not sure whether that really was decisive for Putin when he was thinking about or planning the invasion. But I think it certainly creates problems now when we think about the possibility of some kind of a diplomatic settlement. And Zelensky indicated over the last 2 or 3 days that he may be open to negotiations regarding neutrality. A number of his statements over the last 4 or 5 days, especially after the NATO summit, where the NATO basically decided not to offer the no-fly zone for Ukraine. In a number of his statements, he was openly resentful about NATO as an alliance. He argued that it's weak and that the responsibility for the deaths of Ukrainians will lie not only with Putin, but also with the leaders of the NATO alliance. These are very tough words to be expressed in public. And I think by doing that, he is maybe preparing public opinion for the reversal of the course. He already yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, he stated that he has been disillusioned with NATO, that he cooled on NATO. These are direct words from him. And so I think he may be open to some kind of a revision as far as foreign policy course is concerned. Now, whether or not this revision would be acceptable for 300 members of the parliament, which is the requirement for the amendment in Ukraine, is under big question, because we still have a large number of deputies who are openly, very strongly, they reject compromises. They're against surrender, against capitulation. And I mentioned public opinion trends in Ukraine. There is actually a belief that Ukraine is going to win very quickly, that the type of resistance that Ukrainians put up would be sufficient to dissuade Russia from further invading Ukraine, from further capturing territories, and may somehow push Russia out of Ukraine. So as long as this optimistic expectations regarding the future of the war persist, I think it will be very difficult to persuade large number of members of parliament to revise the foreign policy course. I think it may be possible only if you see costs accumulate on Ukraine and on Ukrainians, and when we see the realization that without a settlement, the war can go on for a very long period of time.
Yes, please.
Hi, Professor. Master's candidate here in the MH. There seems to be a narrative emerging that Putin seems to have made two gross miscalculations. One, the ease of the military side of the operation, and miscalculating the West response, the economic sanctions, or anything else. I would ask, it's sort of two-part question. One, do you agree that he made gross miscalculations? And if so, was that the result of his own judgment or sort of the flow of information that gets to him as an autocratic leader with a bunch of people around him that aren't really intelligent?
Yeah, so on that second point, there is a very important book for understanding today's events and foreign policy of dictators by Jessica Wicks. It's called Dictators at War. And in that book, she creates a conceptualization or typology of different dictators depending on the type of authoritarian structures they have. And she argues that those dictators that are not constrained by any political party, for example, or by some kind of a circle of supporters that have an influence, these dictators, this personalistic type of dictators, are most prone to miscalculations. Not only that, but they are also most prone to risk-taking. And the reason why they're willing to take risks is because they understand that since a lot of power is concentrated in their hands, even the defeat itself does not really threaten their political survival. And she showed that in many countries that where dictators rely on a political party or a larger body, if they are defeated in war, they're immediately removed from power. So for them, as an attempt to launch a war that may produce defeat increases risks for them personally, not just for the country, not just for the public. And in this case, I think there's two factors played a role. So on one hand, we've seen over the last years increased personalization of Putin's regime. One of my colleagues, Timothy Fry, has a book on Russia that was published last year, where he defines Russia as a personalistic dictatorship. And we've seen, for example, at the National Security Council meeting, where Putin announced his recognition of the independence of two Donbas republics, the type of behavior that his subordinates showed. For me, it was striking. I was watching it live, and I could not believe the kind of complete submission that they demonstrated to his individual will, and even the positioning of Putin behind the large table by himself, and them sitting at a distance in a row of chairs, coming one by one as if they're students answering at the exam, and telling them, yes, we agree with you, we need to recognize their independence. That whole theatrical performance clearly demonstrated that Putin really does not have much of respect for people that work with him in these top positions. And then, of course, we later learned that Putin signed his decrees recognizing the independence of these separatist republics even before that National Security Council took place. So he really didn't care very much about their opinion. And so in that sense, I think the constraints he faced when making these decisions were really minimal. And hence he very much relied on the input from his closest confidants, who are from the KGB, from the Leningrad clan or circle of former KGB officials, people like Patrushev, for example, who very much share Putin's viewpoints regarding Ukraine, who have a very similar type of view about the inadmissibility of Ukrainian independence or unacceptability of Ukrainian independence, who have this theory of or assumptions about inferiority, some kind of inferiority of the Ukrainians, who are just these little Russians who really should not have should not have as much of a say about their future. So I think the lack of proper information, and I know that many Russian experts also express their disbelief, Russian foreign policy experts express their disbelief when the invasion began, because there was also a consensus, near consensus within the Russian foreign policy establishment, among experts even close to Putin, that this type of action is unlikely to happen because from the rational standpoint, costs seem to be far outweighing any potential benefits that he could draw. So yes, I think there was miscalculation that was largely stemming from the nature of the authoritarian regime that Putin constructed.
Are there any other questions in the room? If not, I'm going to turn to the online sphere. Okay, there are a lot of questions that have come in, and I want to maybe start bunching some of them together in the interest of time. There seems to be a few themes, one of them coming out about NATO, and I don't know how much you want to comment or speculate in terms of NATO's next steps and reactions, but Aaron Reibel asks, do you foresee an increased effort by NATO members, likely France or Poland, to provide Ukraine with mounted anti-air weapons now that a deal to supply Soviet era fighters looks unlikely? Would that lead to Russian retaliation against France or Poland? There's another one from Melanie Goldberg, who's asking, what should NATO or how should NATO respond to the Ukrainian request of a no-fly zone? Where do you see this, let's say, field and sort of maneuvering with NATO? How do you see that playing out?
Yes, well, I'm in Switzerland right now, affiliated with the University of Basel for the last month. And I gave a number of talks in Switzerland where a lot of people are concerned about the possibility of some kind of a broader conflict that will spill over into Western Europe. And even though Switzerland did not have conflict for 200 years, I see that Switzerland, not being a member of NATO, is still very much concerned about these issues. So my general sense is that the principle of deterrence will stand. There is little reason to believe that Putin will act against the very basic national security interests of the Russian Federation, that is survival. Because we understand that any type of escalation that leads to a direct military exchange with the members of NATO alliance will very quickly put the very survival of the Russian state at stake. And so even though many, from what I understand and see in the West, were surprised about Putin's actions regarding Ukraine and thought these were irrational and were a sign of some kind of a turn in his mental state of mind, I actually think that from his perspective, these actions were quite rational because, as I explained, for a long period of time, he was attempting to curse Ukraine in a different direction. And this is just one point in a very long history of coercion that he exercised. He also, and I think Lavrov talked about that, foreign minister, he was very open and transparent for quite some time about their desire not to see Ukraine in NATO. So for them, the kinds of public pronouncements that they made before the war began somehow is a sign and evidence that they showed to the West and to the Russian public that their cards were open for a long time, that they had nothing to hide. And I think Lavrov even cited Mirsheimer's article in Foreign Affairs, where Mirsheimer talks about the possibility of direct war with Ukraine over NATO membership as another evidence that you see some of the foreign policy experts could foresee that. So I do not think that additional military assistance that would be coming from European countries, members of NATO, would somehow put them in danger. Now, no-fly zone, of course, is a very different type of choice, strategic choice that the NATO members would have to make. I know that Ukrainian, as I mentioned, Ukrainian society is waiting for this choice, and you can understand why. You look at Mariupol, you look at Kharkiv, you look at many other Ukrainian cities, and you understand that there is a sense of direct and immediate danger to the civilians. And when I talk to many Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, and I come from Western Ukraine, many of my relatives are still there, they are concerned that the escalation that will happen will lead to annihilation of entire cities in Western Ukraine. And their logic is the following: if Putin is destroying cities that have been sympathetic to Russian political parties with such a brutality, if he is bombing these cities so much where Russian speakers live, how would he treat regions of Ukraine that voted for nationalist parties or pro-Western political parties? And even though there is no direct military action right now with regard to my city, Lviv, for example, or other cities in Western Ukraine, nothing is off the table. And so for many Ukrainians who live there, this is a very serious concern. So many believe that, obviously, if you have a no-fly zone that is for the entire country, it will be very difficult to enforce, introduce, and justify. But a limited no-fly zone that will be declared over parts of Western Ukraine for the insurance of the provision of humanitarian convoys, evacuating people from out of the war zone, that is something that maybe the West could accept. Where you would see a specific area in Western Ukraine that would be protected by the Western Air Force. Now, we also understand that for the no-fly zone to be enforced and to be real, you need to have a desire and willingness and commitment to act when violations are happening, and that means attacking Russian planes if they appear in this no-fly zone. And so I think, obviously, the concerns about escalation of the conflict are reasonable, that may escalate and draw broader other countries into this conflict. But I think this idea of the limited no-fly zone could become the basis for some type of negotiations with Putin and with Russia. And maybe from his side, there would be at least a desire to make some type of a concession and agree on a limited no-fly zone that was, for example, I think was enforced for some time in Syria as well. So there has been a precedent set in other countries, and this is not something that I would, not an idea that I would just completely dismiss as a prospect.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Okay, I'm going to keep going down the list. There's so many questions that have come in. Let me ask you about the role of external actors in mediating. We've seen Macron on the phone. We've seen Bennett. We've seen leaders in the UAE, Saudi Arabia. There have been reports that Schroeder is trying to negotiate. Do you see any prospect emerging from these efforts to find a political solution? Do you see that there might be some sort of outcome that could be amenable to all these efforts? And would that even be something that could be tenable to Ukrainians? Obviously, there's some sort of interest from the international community to reduce the conflict, the war, and bring it to some sort of rightful conclusion. But how do you see all of this playing out? And who could be, useful interlocutors for Ukrainians, or is it just that Ukrainians are their own interlocutors?
Yes, well, so let me just say that there have been no mediation so far. Mediation requires the presence of mediating party between Zelensky and Putin. So far, we've seen an attempt by a series of Western leaders to somehow understand what really Putin wants, what his plans are, what is his strategy. And so from this standpoint, his meetings with the foreign leaders does not really indicate that he is willing to directly discuss these things with Zelensky. The negotiations that have been happening on the level of the foreign ministers have been completely futile up until this point. They do not seem to produce any results. We've seen today, for example, there was a meeting in Turkey with Turkish participation that they could not even agree on the idea of evacuation of the civilians from the conflict zone. I think the key problem is that really Lavrov or any of the officials, there is a Medinsky is the leader of the Russian delegation in Belarus that was talking to Ukrainian side. These leaders are not independent decision makers. Medinsky himself, his appointment as the leader of the head of the Russian delegation was really an expression of disrespect towards Ukraine, because Medinsky is known for his anti-Ukrainian statements, and they suddenly appoint him as the leader of that delegation. So it doesn't seem like the diplomatic process at this point is something acceptable for Putin. And the problem, I think, is that the expectations that he raised as far as the outcome is concerned are so high. The way they're articulated to the Russian public, they already seem completely unrealistic from the Ukrainian standpoint. The demands for denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, which means Ukraine cannot have any armed forces. These two goals by themselves would be humiliating for Ukrainians to accept. And so I do not think there is much they can talk at this point in time, no matter who mediates, until there is an adjustment in terms of Putin's expectations of how this war may end and how long it will take for Russia. And also, of course, the adjustment on the side of the Ukrainians as far as what the possible compromise could be.
So in the context of that, let me just throw out a question from Ajay here. What are the prospects or possibilities of use of nuclear weapons, even if limited to tactical use? And if, you know, we put that as scenario as one on the one side, are there ways that you could sort of envision that Putin might de-escalate and withdraw without losing face or reduce his objectives? Like, what would be that? What would that process look like?
On the use of tactical nuclear weapons, this is the question that I hear a lot from Ukrainians themselves, especially those who live in Western Ukraine, as I said, who believe that his disrespect for civilian lives would be even stronger when it comes to other regions of Ukraine. Of course, for that to happen, there needs to be a very significant justification. And he may, of course, draw on the precedent of the United States and suggest that this is what they did to finish the war in Japan. But really, comparability of these two cases, it's impossible to imagine. Tactical nuclear weapons is something that can be used, of course, to reduce the costs of war, future war for the Russians. So from the tactical standpoint, this may be the calculation that he may be using. But the effect that it will have, because remember, the large parts of Ukraine, Western Ukraine especially, close to Western countries, would be counterproductive, because it will ultimately lead to what Putin may be trying to avoid, and that is from drawing these countries into further conflict, because this type of escalation may be viewed by many countries in the West as a direct threat to them, and will trigger an Article 5. And hence produce a retaliation on the part of NATO countries. Now, as far as his personal adjustment of his goals are concerned, I do not see it at this point. This is the war that he staked his legacy on. The outcome of this conflict is something that will define how he will be remembered. I think that is how he views it. And so I think whatever costs he would pay in order to acquire certain types of concessions that he wants to see from Ukrainian side. So I think maybe some of the rhetoric regarding regime change, some that may be adjusted. He can live with President Zelensky, certainly, and give up on the idea that Yanukovych or any other political leader can somehow govern the rest of Ukraine. But some of the other goals, I think, regarding direct influence on the rules by which some of the territories live, autonomy or independence of Donbass and Crimea, surrender of territories, some of the territories by Ukraine, that is something that he really would insist on, I think.
Okay, thank you. We've come to the end of time, and
Yes.
I wanted to, on behalf of everyone who's here and everyone online, thank you.
Thank you very
It's
much.
great to see you again, first of all, but thank you for sharing all of your expertise and analysis. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances, but we really appreciate you joining us here, and we look forward to welcoming you back. Please join
Thank
me in
you.
thanking Professor Kudelia. That was really. I'm just gonna let me get my coat,
Yes.
and I'm gonna walk you over to that house.